Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's AMA, Ask Me Anything, put on by the Reddit community, who are all working behind the scenes, and they're an incredible group of very dedicated people. My name is Leslie Kean. I'm an investigative reporter. I think most of you probably are familiar with me. I've hosted other AMAs before for Reddit. And today we're going to have a really interesting discussion based around the questions of aviation safety by the two people who have contributed most to that area of investigation in the UAP field. So let me just introduce our guests, and then we will go right into the questions and the discussions. First of all, we have Dr. Richard Haines, who is a former senior scientist from NASA. He has a PhD in experimental psychology, and he worked for many years at the NASA Ames Research Center. He became chief of the Space Human Factors Office there in 1986 and retired as a senior scientist from NASA. And he has published numerous papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals, very technical papers around engineering and aviation and all kinds of issues. An incredibly accomplished scientist and wonderful human being who I've known for a long time. And what's really relevant here is not only his background, but he founded a group in the year 2000 called NARCAP. That stands for the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena. And many of the younger members of our audience may not have heard about that organization, NARCAP. And it was extremely important. And I'm going to tell you a little more about it in a minute, but I also want to introduce our second guest, Ryan Graves. And Ryan is a little bit late getting here. He will be joining us. He just had some things come up and will be a few minutes late. But most of you are familiar with Ryan. As most of you know, he's a former Lieutenant U.S. Navy pilot. And he was really the first active duty pilot to come forward on the UAP issue, which he did in this story that, there he is. Ryan also testified in Congress before the House Committee of Oversight and Accountability in 2023. And you can see him there with David Grush and David Fravor. He is the co-founder and executive director of Americans for Safe Aerospace, which is a very important group that has been working with Congress to work on legislation and also to investigate and receive cases from pilots, both commercial and military pilots. And he'll tell us more about his work when he comes on. But right now, I'm going to introduce you to Richard Haines. And just to give a little bit of a story, which is very meaningful to me, is that I started reporting on UAP in 2000 with my Boston Globe story. And the second story I did on this topic back in 2001, when it was incredibly taboo and like nobody was writing for mainstream media on this topic. It was a story for the Providence Journal, Providence, Rhode Island. This is a picture of the hard copy. And it was about a report that Richard Haines had produced with his colleagues at NARCAP, a 100-page study of these, or 100 cases. It was a long study of incredibly important, dramatic aviation safety cases that nobody knew about, cases where pilots and aircraft were affected by the proximity of these objects. So what was interesting to me, it was really a big deal for me to get this story out because nobody was doing this then. So it went out, after it came out in the Providence Journal, you can see that it looks very serious, and I was fine with the headline and everything. Then it went out over the wires. It was picked up everywhere, which is sort of the equivalent today of something going viral. We had this thing called the wire service back in the old days, and all the stories went out and other papers picked them up. And I remember being really sensitive to the fact that when this was the kind of thing that went on, when other papers picked it up, they put this silly cartoon on the top and wrote this silly headline, right? And it was like they couldn't quite take it seriously. So I just wanted to share this because this was a different world in 2001. And I was dealing with this kind of thing, although, my stories were treated with a lot of respect, but this just really bugged me, as the headline says. So anyway, and then 18 years later, I reported on Ryan Graves, and we'll we can talk about that later when Ryan comes, but there was in the New York Times in 2019, I was able to introduce Ryan Graves to the world with my colleague Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper. And after having introduced Dick Haines to the world in 2001. So I'm just very proud of the kind of continuity that these two incredible pioneers represent, and that I was able to help bring them forward. And to me, that's just really meaningful. So that's partly why it's so meaningful for me to have them here today. And while, you know, we're waiting for Ryan to join us, but Dick, welcome. It is just such a treat to see you and have you on this dialogue today. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to the questions that people are going to ask.
There are some really smart people in Reddit with great questions. We can start, though. We will get to the questions, but we might want to start with this one case that I've always loved, and I reported on it in my book in 2010. And it came from you and your research in that study that we just mentioned, called Aviation Safety in America. And this is the case of this pilot, TWA pilot by the name of Phil Shultz. And here we have a picture of what he encountered. And you researched this case heavily, and you sat with him and talked to him. So, you know, I wonder if, I guess it was in 1983, was it? I believe.
Yep.
So maybe would you like to just tell us a little bit about this? Because this is such a good example of the kinds of cases that you were focused on when you were doing that investigation.
Sure, sure. Well, to begin the story, we have to go back probably 9 months before this event even happened, because Phil came in to NASA Ames, where I was working at the time. I was doing simulator work in a flight simulator we had there, a 720 model. And we would have him fly the research and so forth that we were doing for NASA. And afterwards, we would go back to my office, and once in a while, I'd just get an urge to ask the pilots the same question. Have you ever seen anything in your flying career that you couldn't identify? And he looked at me at that time and he said, no, absolutely not. I never will. I don't believe in them. End of story. And I said, okay, I understand. But would you do me a favor and take this pilot reporting form that I have? I had some copies there, and put it in your briefcase, and you'll never need it, but maybe you'll meet a pilot who does. And he finally accepted that and walked out the door. And I didn't see him again for about 9 months. He called me up 9 months later on the telephone, and he said, Dr. Haines, you're never going to believe what just happened to me. And so I had him brief me over the telephone, but he was in San Francisco on a layover. I take that back. He lives in south of the airport there in Peninsula. But we made arrangements for me to go to the airport, San Francisco International, meet him at the airplane, and he got me through security. I brought a camera, took pictures of him in the cockpit, got the full story, and he looked at me and he said in a very convincing tone, I became a believer in about 20 seconds. And to me, from a psychological point of view, that is very significant. He was a skeptic. Now he's a believer. And I then asked him, here is a picture of him. I sat behind him, as you can see, and I asked him to show me from the visual point of view how large the object was at its largest. And here he is actually showing me. This is very valuable. This puts a visual angle on the left to the right side of the object. Well, to make a long story short, I had him fill out the pilot reporting form, which I use with every pilot when I'm interviewing them, so that we have a standardization, basically. We have the same questions asked in the same way, using aeronautical terms, give the opportunity for them to sketch it, which they did here. He did here, as you can see. But he said something really very significant, I think, that I haven't heard very often. He said to me that when that object first appeared, it appeared full size. It did not start as a point and then grow in size. It as if it broke through the atmosphere. It kind of broke full scale, full size into view, and then it approached him on a high speed. We calculated approximately 1,000 miles an hour, did a high speed turn. We calculated the rate of turn, approximately a 20 G gravitational turn, and then it went away from him in about the same direction it arrived originally, which was to the north. He was over Lake Michigan at the time. I said, well, what did you do next during this event? And he said, well, we got on the radio right away and called Chicago Center, and they said to him, we don't see anything on radar. That as the object was approaching or going away, it was not registered on radar. So to me, that's an interesting case.
Yeah.
He was honest enough, brave enough to come forward with the data, which a lot of pilots still not ready to do. And I think Ryan's going to reinforce that truth, that there's still a stigma out there, and I hope that we can talk about that today. So that's kind of an overview of the Phil Shultz case.
That's really interesting. And of course, you were living you were dealing with a lot of stigma when he submitted that report. That's why he had nowhere else to go. He went to NARCAP, and NARCAP was there for people. Yeah, and you mentioned about it coming full size.
Before NARCAP. This was
before.
Yeah,
True.
Right.
So you were doing it on your own for years, but I love the fact that on that form, he actually said he witnessed what he called a bending of the atmosphere. Like you said, it just came in full size. He didn't come from a distance.
Right.
It's just
I asked him about that, and he used the analogy of a spider web, that there are radiating lines out from the center of a spider web, and that the atmosphere seemed to crinkle. That's my word, not his, as the object appeared full size originally or initially. And then, of course, it did enlarge as it got closer. It did a high-speed turn, and it rolled actually like this, so that he could see it now from the side, not from underneath. And as it was seen from the side, it had a row of equally spaced dark circles. He didn't know what they were. And I asked him, Phil, could you give me an estimate how big that object was that you think you saw? And he said to me, it was as big as a football stadium. Whoa, that's big.
That is big.
From a scientific, just a physics point of view, that raises a very important question. Where does the energy come from? The inertia involved if it has mass, and apparently it did have mass. It had very sharp edges, high contrast. It was silvery, metallic-like. It reflected sunlight. It was a full sunny day, no clouds in the sky. Where does the energy come from? How does it maneuver? How does it navigate? How does it coordinate its movements? Why did it roll as it approached and then went off in the opposite direction? These are challenging questions that aerodynamicists and other scientists really should take a look at.
Fascinating questions. Thank you, Dick. And I've just, Ryan Graves has now arrived. So I want to welcome Ryan to join us. There he is. Hey, Ryan.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Rob.
We just talked about the Phil Shultz case. So, I don't know if I've introduced you already, Ryan. Shall we jump into some questions?
Sure.
Maybe there's one.
Apologies to everyone for being delayed.
It's no problem. Happy you could join us. So here's a question for Ryan, and this is from the experiencer group in Reddit from MantisAwakening. For Ryan, have you investigated cases where pilots describe non-visual interactions with UAP, such as telepathic communication or physiological effects? Does this create a flight safety issue with pilots dealing with ontological shock while flying? Fantastic question.
Yeah. Good question. So yeah, when I think of aviation safety as it relates to UAP, I think of it in two different ways. I think of the pilot's input to the aircraft in response to seeing the object. Perhaps they maneuver because they're about to have a midair. Perhaps they might become distracted because they become fixated on it, something called target fixation, which is a very important thing in aviation. But the second side of that is after the aviation safety concerns have been addressed, right? It's not an immediate impact. Perhaps they've reported it to ATC. Often the air crew are left with just dealing with this, what might be a remarkable incident and not understanding how to process it. And, that can seem like a, fancy word, processing, but, you have a guy that's now potentially, or gal, rethinking, their place in the universe, not sure how to really contend with what they just saw, have no framework to fit it into, don't know how to follow up on it or who to talk to about it. It can create a big issue. And there are pilots that I've spoken to who have gone home and drug tested themselves after their experiences because they didn't know how else to rationally think about what they had experienced. Others who have, held on to their experiences for 20 or 30 years who have shared them with me for the first time, or others who have shared them with their wife and no one else for 6 months, but finally think they can do something about it. So that's absolutely, I think, critical to kind of the support and safety infrastructure is, I think part of addressing that is the education piece and ensuring pilots are at least have some expectation that this could occur. So they're not dealing with it and processing it for the first time and have no real framework. And of course, education with how they can report it so that they understand that there is follow-up for it. As far as like an emotional response, such as, vis-a-vis Jake Barbara, who reported a very strong and intimate emotional connection. That's a tricky question because you don't know what you don't know, right? And I imagine something like that might be difficult to share with someone that they just met versus reporting, an aviation safety incident. No, I haven't had people report to me similar instances, but I imagine that doesn't necessarily mean that hasn't occurred. It very much may have, but that's a pretty hard thing, I think, to share with someone. I don't know. There is another maybe element to this as well, where people see something and they observe it and they get a very strong sense that it's now observing and reacting to them as well. I think that's, another aspect of this as well, as far as like kind of a psychological connection, if you will. But I hope that answered the question.
Yeah,
Leslie,
Dick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add, I agree with everything Ryan said. And with so many pilots already having come forward with a lot of flight experience and education and training and so forth, maybe it's time to be thinking seriously about support groups where they can get together privately and almost like AA share some of their concerns and to find out they're not so unique. That would be a possible approach to this. It would take some organization, a lot of organization, I would think, but it might play a role in diffusing or reducing the psychological stress responses.
Yeah. Do you know, Ryan, if any of that's going on? I mean, I'm sure some of the pilots that come to you end up meeting other pilots who are also working with you, right?
Yeah, we have hundreds of pilots who have reported, but also remain extremely interested in following up and remaining connected to their experience and to know what others are experiencing as well. So that's something we're actually looking to formulate. We have all the pieces and components to do it at Americans for Safe Aerospace. It's just about, bringing together a little bit of resources so that we can start bringing together those pilots, through an aviation safety summit that's focused on this topic. And arming them with, literature and ways that they can share how to report and what to look for to others on the flight line and start, kind of harness that ambassador network, if you will. So I think we have the right framework to do it, and we have a strategy to do it, and we're close to being able to move out on that.
That's fantastic. And there have been a lot of questions about the recent drone incursions that we saw. You know, we're kind of peaked in December, but over the last months, I understand that some of them are still going on in different parts of the world. So can either of you comment on what you think might be going on with these drones?
Yeah, I can start. So yeah, you know, this was something that, you know, may have started in 2021, although there's maybe not a direct correlation out in Colorado in the middle of the country. But in 2022 at Langley Air Force Base, they detected objects. 2023, again, objects were observed over the base during the same time period. And 2024, the expectation was that something might pop up again. And of course, we had a large outcropping of observations in New Jersey, as well as across various military bases that seem to span pretty far. Whether they were part of the same, you know, occurrences that happened in New Jersey, or whether they were coincidental base incursions that elsewhere in the country is unknown. Yeah, I think help people understand the seriousness when we mentioned the importance of being able to maintain air superiority and knowing what's in our airspace. Where the Langley Air Force Base occurred, that was about only 80 miles north of where we were seeing objects in our areas back in 2013 or so when I was flying. And Langley provides a lot of the air response for Washington, D.C. in an emergency air situation. So pretty critical infrastructure that was shut down, and the aircraft even had to move. Sadly, as I predicted on Joe Rogan, you know, I thought that this would probably die down around Christmas and media attention would trickle off and probably not pick up. But that seems to have generally been the case. However, there still seems to be very consistent reporting and imagery coming out of the area. Locals that I've spoke to, you know, are claiming that they're still seeing these objects. And it's a shame that we didn't have the ability to respond to it, even though there was an expectation that something would occur. But that's, you know, part of the problem in this whole conversation is that the people that should have the ability to respond aren't treating this with the proper attention that it deserves. And we've seen how our policy and our procedure across agencies aren't well aligned to respond to these types of incidents over our own airspace and our own soil. And, you know, it's a shame because we've seen, you know, there's been so much talk of how warfare is developing in Ukraine with these small form factor aerial vehicles. We're developing them ourselves. You know, it's some of the work that I used to do when I left the Navy. And to think that, you know, we didn't even incorporate the mechanisms to even respond, never mind the technology to even defend back home, is, you know, a glaring issue, especially for someone who has been crying about the issues that these objects represent for the past 8 years or so.
Yeah. Anything you want to say, Dick, or should we go on to another question? Thank you for that, Ryan. Go on to the next question?
Yep, let's do.
All right, let's go to another question. This is for Richard Haines. It's from the group Our UFOs, and it's from Braveoldfart777. People come up with very creative names. Anyway, this is for Richard Haines. Some argue that publicly addressing UAPs could cause unnecessary panic or confusion among passengers. How do you think the aviation community can balance public safety with ensuring pilots are adequately informed about flight safety risks associated with UAP encounters?
Well, that is a very important question. And it's complex, and I have a couple answers that don't agree with each other. So let me try it. First of all, yes, there is a concern with passenger panic when they're on board the airplane during a flight, particularly if the cabin crew doesn't do an effective job of dealing with it emotionally and with instructions and maintaining calm and so forth. But no, I would say there's not a problem with panic in the passengers at least, when they're on the ground. They got to be in the airplane to be panicking. And so for the last 50 years, our culture has been bombarded from Hollywood and other places with ET and strange shaped objects in the sky and so forth, such that I think we've become kind of conditioned. We're more willing to accept the reality of anomalous phenomena in the sky. And so there's not a problem with panic there. Now, where there is panic is in aviation, commercial aviation management. They're panicked that their airplane on a commercial flight, a scheduled flight, is going to have 300 passengers on board and have an encounter at altitude. That's when the panic begins, because that impacts the bottom line. And so the part of the answer, I think, to getting to deal with the panic has to deal with the management, first of all, who will issue better rules and regulations in the cockpit and stewardess training and so forth. The American people, I think, can take a lot more reality than the authorities think. That we've been conditioned so well, so much, that it's almost, excuse me, it's almost, I have to hang up on this. Sorry about that. It's almost a given that if it does happen to you in flight, you can cope with it. The pilot will know what to do. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I should have unplugged this. So
mean,
anyway, that's probably all I have to say about that.
I mean, that's the argument for pilots being informed and for everyone being informed about the possibility of such an encounter so they can be prepared for it. And then, because even the pilots might kind of freak out and not know what to do.
Right.
Is what the Cometa report argued for back in 2000, 25 years ago. And it really still hasn't happened, I guess. I mean, Ryan, to what extent have we improved that situation? Like when I wrote my book in 2010, the FAA did not even want to receive any reports on these things. And they told their pilots, it was in the manual, they needed to go report it to a civilian group if they had an encounter with a UAP. They don't even want to hear about it. Mm-hmm. So have we changed? Has that changed much?
I think it is changing. I expect that the regulations will likely update to have that reporting go to a centralized location. I don't know whether the listeners will, appreciate who that information will be going to, but but at least there's some formal activity to centralize that type of information. But the barrier that I typically see is that pilots are now reporting it to air traffic control, but they don't know what to do with the information. There is technically a reporting mechanism that they have the option to participate in that is required to go through their manager. So that, it is kind of a process, but the education on utilizing that system or existence of it seems pretty low. So there seems to be a hang up actually receiving those reports. Pilots themselves aren't filing a report for the most part themselves. And I think they feel like they've done their duty once they've sent that information off the FAA to their traffic controllers, but there seems to be a disconnect with what they do with that information. So I would encourage pilots to report it through their aviation safety channels or at safeaerospace.org.
Right. Do you think that part of the problem there really is all the paperwork involved?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. I think even before that, though, there's a lack of knowledge that there's ways to report it. But absolutely, once there's awareness of it, and I've seen that complaint in the military as well. The guys say, all right, great, there's like another thing I need to do. I need to go in a classified space. I need to fill it out, and I'm never going to hear anything from it. Right. So it's not going to improve the situation. So why even do it? You kind of get that attitude, which is why it's so important to have two-way communication with the reporters to have this information out so people can follow up and see what's going on.
Back when I was still working at Ames in California, the ASRS program was being monitored, or actually run from NASA Ames. And so I made an appointment to go talk with the director there. This was probably 1995 at the latest, and asked for a printout that they could do of these kinds of reports coming in. And they did. They provided, I don't know, about 20 reports to me at that time. They've been very cooperative, I must say. But I'm curious, from your perspective, have they continued to be supportive and outgoing and cooperative?
The pilots themselves?
No, the ASRS database.
Oh, the database. Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Yes. We've reached out to them under the auspices of my work at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in order to provide recommendations for accepting this information. And their program manager has been very open to that and inviting us into conversations. There was actually a interagency working group that was put together in order to generate, an official recommendation on how the system could be improved about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago that we were invited to participate in. But it kind of fell through. It seemed like they were waiting for more guidance from leadership in order to be able to implement, the working group and the changes, and it never came. But we're still in contact with them and, ready to support them. Perhaps if the legislation I've supported is approved and voted on, then that would, they would be in a position where they're motivated to actually go about that work, and we could guide them in it.
Can you give us an update on that legislation, Ryan?
Well, last year it was introduced by Congressman Garcia and Grothman. Right on the tail end, they finished up of the FAA reauthorization bill. So we tried to get it in on that, but we weren't successful, which wasn't surprising. And then we couldn't get it in the NDAA amendment as well because of a procedural issue. But we're optimistic this year that we're going to have a shot to get it into the NDAA this year.
Great. And what in a nutshell, what does the legislation say, or what is it calling for?
It requires the FAA to preserve and collect the data that accompanies or may accompany reports that pilots submit either to air traffic control or through their own mechanism, such as radar data or communication data. It requires them to modify the aviation safety reporting system to accept UAP reports or to utilize, another system to be able to collect that data that's specific for UAP. And it requires them to socialize and educate pilots on how to utilize that reporting system with the goal of reducing stigma to increase reporting. And it would also classify these reports as an aviation safety or an occupational health issue, essentially. So anyone reporting this would be protected by existing whistleblower protections.
Wow, sounds really, really important.
Yeah, I think it would really help open up the floodgates. A lot of pilots are still very concerned for their own careers to report this, even today.
Right. Well, should we go on to another question from one of our Reddit participants? This question is for Ryan. Do you hear from commercial pilots? And what is one of the more compelling incidents you have heard from a commercial pilot recently?
Sure. I hear from commercial pilots all the time. It seems to be an increase of reports about, pretty close encounters. We've had recently this one's maybe not perfectly recently, but a 737 coming within 500 feet of a black triangle at about 15,000 feet as they were climbing, nose to nose, 180 degrees out. Both pilot and the co-pilot saw it. Air traffic control had nothing on their radar. Described it the same. Centralized, glowing, I believe, blue light on the apexes of the triangle, as well as one in the center that was more purple. About 200 yards per edge. I mean, bigger than the 737. 500 feet is very close. That's basically a merge, in a jet with another jet, set up a dogfight. So they were pretty shooken up by that event, as you can imagine. And this was actually the pilot that drug tested himself after the flight, trying to kind of deal with what he was seeing. And just recently we had another report of a relatively near miss with a black triangle as well, about 800 feet somewhere else. And there's another one that just popped up with a disc-shaped object that came within about 3,000 feet of a commercial airliner. I mean, there's so many. It's hard to even just highlight one or two that are, most influential. And it happens so repeatedly and consistently. It's it's hard to ignore.
Especially when you realize, Ryan, as you said, told Congress, it's only a small percentage of these pilots that even report them. So what about the other ones, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, Dick, you did a study, I remember. Didn't you do a survey? And maybe it's changed now, but there was only a very small percentage of pilots that were reporting anything, even back in the day when you were doing this, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to get this kind of statistic, obviously. And you have to do estimates. And one of the estimate parameters has to be there's 2 men in the cockpit, or sometimes 3. And how many of them in a given case will report it? And I have quite a number of cases in my files that only one will report it, and the rest will stay quiet, basically. And raises the question why. And it could be job security. And I have a story about that if you're interested. But at any rate, the statistics are very, very hard. And I'm really hesitant to give you an estimate because it would be so biased. 1 in 20, 1 in 50, 1 in 100. Pick your number.
Right. It's really, really incredible when you think about it, how many sightings there are.
Yeah.
And it's a miracle that we haven't had any crashes yet, mid-air collisions or anything. I mean, does that surprise you, Ryan? Or do you think that it's because the technology of the objects is so advanced that they just aren't going to let that happen?
Yeah, I've always made the argument that the risk comes not from, from the objects themselves hitting us or something of that nature. It's how the pilot reacts to this and where they're operating to in the aviation flight environment, right? So I mean, I got multiple reports of pilots being distracted at 1,000 feet as they're coming in to land at an airport full, with aircraft full of people, and both him and their co-pilot just staring at a tic tac shaped object 1,000 feet off their wing and busting through altitudes, for example. So that's where I think the risk more lies is the pilot's reaction, whether it's a physical reaction and input to the stick, or whether it's a distraction that causes them to ignore other things. I mean, that's how every accident happens. With the systems in place now, it's never just, one thing smashing into something. A bunch of things have to fall out of place for an accident to happen.
Right.
Could I jump in here with a comment? Yes. I agree 100%. You put your finger on the prime concern. Years ago, when we were putting NARCAP together, we came with some justifications for doing it. And we developed a list of potential problems that might occur. And they included, as you say, from top of the list is an inappropriate control input to the airplane. But there's a dimension there out of a pilot may be very curious about the phenomenon. And so what we found some of them doing is trying to communicate with the object or the phenomenon. and they would wiggle their wings, or they turn on their landing lights or whatever, day or night, whatever, in trying to communicate with this phenomenon. Well, that's a distraction, clearly. There's no doubt about that. But there's also the possibility of an electromagnetic interference with some cockpit systems, let's call it, including radio and radar and direction finding and so forth. And in our database from years ago, we found approximately 20% of the total cases involved some EM interaction with the flight, with the airplane. But there's another dimension, and that is turbulence, air turbulence. And we found a couple cases, not very many, where like passing through a contrail at altitude, for instance, you get this bump, and the passengers don't know about it. They're not warned ahead of time, and some of them will jump up out of their seat and so forth. Is there an air turbulence of some kind related to the phenomenon in flight? In which case, then the pilot also has to cope with that as far as control, and then messaging to the passengers in the back. So I agree with you that it's the first and foremost is how the crew handles the situation. Do they panic? Do they act impulsively and put the wrong inputs in? At altitude, cruise altitude, the great majority of sightings we had in our database occurred at cruise altitude. Now, maybe that's changing. And from what you've suggested, sounds like it is, which is a significant data point if that's true. And it raises the issue of drones, of man-made vehicles at lower altitude, and so forth and so on. I guess that would be my answer to your question.
You know, just real quick, another possibility for having more sightings down low could be the increase in automation capabilities at low altitude flight regimes, which allow the pilots to have their eyes out more often than they normally would.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you for that discussion. It's so fascinating. Let's go to the next question. I guess this is for either one or both of you. It's from UFOB, and it's from Braveoldfart777 again. How can you balance UAP-related flight advisories for commercial aviation without the fear of disclosing sensitive military or defense-related information?
Sure, I can take that one. I wonder if Braveoldfart777 stands for 777, aircraft, but who knows? Well, ultimately, the simplest answer is ultimately that whoever is the security manager for the individual program is responsible for securing the program. It's not the responsibility of the public to avoid seeing certain things. So, you know, when we have very secret and classified information, we have or systems, we have specific ranges and places where we utilize those. And if someone is walking down Main Street and they look up and they see an ultra classified aircraft, you know, it's not that person's responsibility. It's the person who authorized that flight and all that. So, ultimately, yeah, it's a problem for the government to ensure that they're not utilizing their ultra advanced or secret capabilities in a place where commercial traffic is seeing them, which should be the expectation anyways.
All right.
Oh, by the way, you know, I mean, they have the capability to do that, right? So, I mean, you know, radar, stealth technology, other capabilities are all good enough. It's basically a finger switch away to go black out, and basically you'd have to be within 5 miles of the, within 120 degrees of a commercial airline cockpit within 5 miles to be visually sighted, right? So, I mean, there's a very limited ability to actually gain sight of something if you want to as a commercial pilot. Sorry, I digress.
No, that's good. It's all good. All right, so let's go to the next question. Here's another one for both of you. I will not repeat the name. It's our friend again, 777. Yeah, he's some great questions, he or she. Do you foresee a future where UAP awareness becomes a formal part of pilot certification and recurrent training programs? If so, what steps would need to be taken today to make this a reality?
Yeah. Sorry, I can start if you want. This is something I've been working on a little bit. You know, American Safe Aerospace, we've been talking with, of course, a lot of pilots, a lot of pilot unions, a lot of pilot organizations. We've been gathering our own research, trying to understand the issue from that perspective, and also allowing certain scientific groups to, with the permission of the pilots, understand the cases more and use that to generate papers and recommendations. And, you know, some of those recommendations I think would be very well suited to be able to, you know, those papers and recommendations can be a body of literature that we can then go to the FAA and be like, you know, clearly this is demonstrated safety issue. The military has claimed that. Here's the evidence. You know, here's suggestions on how the training pipeline can be improved to accommodate, you know, this reality such that this is no longer a surprise to aviators. And, you know, it will have to most likely include training on the latest of, you know, low Earth orbit satellites and their operations, right? So pilots are not confused by Starlink and things of that nature. So I think it's a needing traded capability or syllabus that's needed addition, because it's not just UAP. There's a lot of other distractions that are, you know, occupying pilots' mind space. So we need to, you know, incorporate UAP and other things into that conversation in a way that's not now. So there's a pathway to do it. I think we just need more data and more, you know, alignment with the pilot unions before we take that step to try to get those changed.
Can I jump in with an addition here? Take you back to the 1970s and 80s approximately, when there was a number of accidents in Denver having to do with wind shear. And at that time, the FAA didn't seem to take it as seriously as they should, as far as I'm concerned. And it required an accident or two to wake them up and to get them oriented towards requiring, in the flight simulator training area, to put their pilots through wind shear, which they did, by the way. Now, here's my point, that when dealing with UAP, we don't have incidents of passengers dying, thank God. And so we don't have quite the pry bar, the inertia, the way to encourage a change at the FAA level to include a UAP encounter in a flight simulator, which is one way to go about this. That would be one approach, I think, is to include a curriculum as part of the standard training, like they do for night flying or instrument whatever, or in this case, wind shear, and to have them run through a couple scenarios, which wouldn't take very long, to and what you do and what you don't do in a close encounter at altitude or wherever.
Yeah. I think we're just gonna digress for 1 second from aviation safety and bring up the photo, the famous photo from Costa Rica, which was, I believe, 1971, taken from a government mapping plane looking down on an object. So, and Dick, you and Richard and Jacques Vallée did extensive studies. There's the photograph. It's, in my opinion, one of the very best official photographs that have ever been released. Again, this was a government photograph from Costa Rica looking down from a mapping plane. So on the left, you see the land, and the dark part is the lake below it. There's a clear disc there, and maybe we could have, in the next image shows a closer up photo of that. I don't know if we have that. There we are. And you and Jacques Vallée, Dick, did extensive studies of this object, which has never been explained, obviously, as anything conventional. Could you just share a little bit about that, what you determined about this picture and how you went about that study?
Sure, be glad to. Yeah, this is a significant photograph. The airplane itself was basically on autopilot, flying back and forth, east to west, west to east, mapping the ground from an altitude of 10,000 feet. Well, that's significant because we know now the absolute distance that object or the phenomenon was located. It couldn't be any farther than 10,000 feet. And so doing calculations of angle and so forth on the negative, we could calculate the size of it, the diameter of it, let's say, which turned out to be around 100, a little over 100 feet. The lake itself is called Lago de Cote, which is located, let me see, it was north, a little bit north of Lake Arenal, for those of you who've been to Costa Rica. It was daytime. It was a single image that was a 9x9 inch negative as part of a full series. And this camera on board the airplane took a new image every, what was it, 20 seconds as the airplane flew horizontally at a constant speed, with about a 20% overlap from image to image to image for registration purposes and so forth. I investigated the original negatives. Jacques was able to obtain the full strip of 3 negatives, this one before, this one, and the one following, and the object is not appearing in either of the other 2. That's very significant, which means that whatever that is, it appeared within 20 seconds, and then it went away within 20 seconds. Now, how that happens, I don't know. But just talking about the object itself, it's reflecting sunlight as a reflecting metallic surface would. It didn't have any edge blur, which means it wasn't moving at the time. The water, we don't know its altitude above the water surface. All we know is the absolute maximum distance it could be. But there, it looks, if you look at the top of this image, you see it looks a little bit darkened or blurred or out of focus, if you will. The implication is that this is like a frisbee-shaped object, which is round when viewed from above, but it is thinner. It might be a low conical section, but one edge of it might be immersed in the water. And so we looked at the possibility of waves. Let's say it emerged from the water and then went back into the water, which was a hypothesis. We were looking for waves that would be produced in the water by a mass, in this case a disc, if you will, metallic disc, as it went in or came out of the water. We didn't find any waves. What this fascinating case suggests is that this is a visual phenomenon, but it doesn't have much mass. There's very little mass associated with it, which would correlate, I think, with a lot of other cases that pilots see in flight. But here we have a photographic representation of this. I could say more, but I think that's perhaps enough at this point. It's a good day. It's a good image.
That's great. Yeah, it's really, really a special image. I wish I can only imagine what our own government possesses that are even better than that in terms of imagery. I mean, I know that that's the fact from people who've seen them, but at least Costa Rica is not keeping all these stuff secret, so we can be grateful for that. Can we have the next question, please? Okay, this is from experiencers. Oh, this is again our friend Braveoldfart777, who I understand is a real fan of both of the work of both of you, Brian and Dick. Sure. Very focused on pilot cases. So this question is for Ryan. What are the concerns or challenges that unions, airlines, or other organizations have about introducing UAP-related training into the curriculum for pilot training or military aviation schools?
Yeah, I think Dick hit on this earlier, right? There just hasn't been the same incentive and motivation because of these perceived severity or risk, associated with the risk factors here that have been identified, right? And I think that doesn't account for the national security concerns that can accompany these objects if they are potentially a foreign adversary. But I'd say the biggest impetus is really just the lack of top-down leadership and direction. That's, I think, pretty much the bottom line is what it boils down to. And there's probably a bunch of different factors why that's the case, but ultimately within these organizations, it's always a priority game. And I don't think this is reaching high enough to be actioned.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Let's go on to the next question. For Richard Haines, again, from our friend 777, some argue that publicly addressing UAPs could cause unnecessary panic or confusion among passengers. I think we already had this question, didn't we? Yeah. How do you think yeah, I think we did. Okay, here's another one. Why are pilots' unions who advocate for flight safety consistently silent as it relates to UAP and the threat to flight safety? And this could be for either one of you.
Yeah, let me jump in on that one briefly. I think the bottom line is the bottom line. The answer is money. I think that the unions are very concerned about this, and perhaps they should be, that there are negative consequences to a possible encounter at altitude or taking off or landing. And by publicizing their support, they become almost complicit, I think, in a legal suit. And so by maintaining ignorance or neutrality, let's say, they perhaps are insulating themselves from that possibility. That's just my personal opinion.
I'll give a slightly different perspective. I think a lot of the effort in organizations related to this have been bottoms up, where it's been people that have been interested and passionate and have tried to affect change within their organization. That's been my experience. And I think some of those people, well, they all recognize the importance of this topic, at least those that are, volunteering themselves for this. And, one thing they've expressed to me is that they see potentially having a reporting system under the union would be beneficial because it would, the union is there to protect the pilot. And so by having a reporting system under the union's banner, it would, protect the pilot. And a way of thinking about that from a managerial perspective is that, the union is then accepting the risk for that, right? Because they're now collecting aviation safety relevant data with no way to integrate that into the existing system. And, there's no conclusion here I'm trying to reach necessarily. I'm just trying to show you some of the kind of pros and cons, but there is a lot of, bottoms up interest in doing this, and it is working its way up. But I can see there being some opposition from leadership. But I'm still, like I said, optimistic.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Well, great questions, great answers. Let's keep going here. What else have we got? This is a question from MantisAwakening from the Experiencers for Richard Haines. You've documented cases where UAP encounters resulted in electromagnetic interference with aircraft systems. Could you elaborate on specific incidents where such effects were observed and discuss the potential implications for flight safety?
Sure. A very prominent case comes to mind. It involved a DC-10 flying from San Francisco to Boston, I believe. And they were approximately over New York. It was nighttime at that time. And the plane was under the control of the first officer. And they had checked in each of the VORs, and it was a normal flight, no problem. There's a few clouds in the way, but the pilot told me, and he actually turned out to be a World War II B-17 pilot, a neighbor of mine in Los Altos, California at the time. And he told me that he was just kind of relaxing in the cockpit, and they maybe had an hour to go, something like that, into Boston. I don't remember what center they were under control, but suddenly the airplane, they were on autopilot actually, but the first officer was in charge. The airplane started to bank left, and rather tight bank, a high wing bank. And what happened was Captain Daniels is his name, or was his name, looked out the left window to clear the area, which is normal procedure, and noticed practically off his left wingtip a very bright, round, white, very intense object, light source, let's call it. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, the first thing I did was I checked the compasses. He just looked down at all three compasses. And this was a DC-10, I believe. I won't give the airline. Well, at any rate, all three compasses were pointing in different directions. Now, that airplane has 2 gyro compasses and 1 magnetic standby compass. The airplane continued off course, maintained altitude, but it just varied in the direction it would fly. And he then turned to the first officer, who couldn't see the object because of the bank of the airplane, put the object above the cutoff of the window, and had the first officer hit the autopilot disconnect and take the controls and bring the airplane wings level and then bank right again back on course. And Captain Daniels told me that when he did that, the object then appeared to diminish in size and then streak away into the night sky. Well, this raises a really important question, I think, about possibility of magnetic influence on the aviation electronics, in this case, the compasses. And so I contacted McDonnell Douglas and asked them for the data on their compass systems, which they sent me. And I found out that the magnetic sensor for the left wingtip is displayed on the co-pilot side of his compass. The magnetic sensor on the right wingtip, for some reason now, is brought across, and it is displayed in front of the captain's compass. It was the left wingtip that was closest to the object, whatever it was. And it was that magnetic influence, I think, which controlled the autopilot in front of the co-pilot and caused the airplane to bank the way it did. And it had to be disconnected by hitting this button on the yoke and bringing the airplane back on course again. I said, well, did you report that? He said, oh, yes. We called Boston Center right away and reported, do you have anything, that shouldn't be up here in our area? And they came back and said, no, there's nobody there but you. Well, that's just one of a number of interesting cases where there could have been a real physical interaction between the phenomenon and the airplane. So just to conclude then, I view airplanes as flying laboratories in the sense that they contain an awful lot of systems on board that can be useful in learning more about the phenomenon. That's one of the reasons we set up NARCAP a long time ago, to try to obtain that data for authorities and changing the way things are done, but to learn some scientific facts at the same time. Something that is not easy to do on the ground. We just have natural capability in an airplane. So anyway, that's just one story of many that included electromagnetic effects.
Are there any more cases, Ryan, that you have?
There's one case in particular that comes into mind that pilots saw a spherical object that went close proximity under their aircraft. When did so, their autopilot system kicked off completely. So it wasn't that major of a safety issue, but it was an interesting one. I thought I'd mention quickly.
Yeah. There was also the very famous case over Tehran, Iran in 1976, where the pilot Parviz Jafari was flying up near this huge diamond-shaped object, and there were these projectiles that came towards him, and his systems kept going out when the projectiles got a certain distance from him. He was trying to shoot them down with missiles because he felt threatened. And every time they got a certain distance, all his systems would just go out. And then when they moved away, they would come back on. So I guess this is the way it works. You lose your systems, but you're not going to crash the plane or anything like that. It's just the communication systems and some of the other things kind of go haywire for a while.
Yeah.
That's right. Isn't that what happens?
Yep. But they can, that's like one part of the problem that then leads to an accident, right? Now the pilot's, task saturated and manually flying, and something else then happens, right? So
it is a danger, of course. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Do we have another question to read here? Okay. This is from MantisAwakening, again from experiencers, for Richard Haines. Based on your research, what psychological and physiological effects do experiencers commonly report after a UAP encounter?
Oh boy. That is it's a good question, but it's also very complex. And it would take, I think, a long time to explore all of them, but let me just kind of summarize. I think that the average person who isn't preconditioned to have a response to this goes through a number of stages. And one of them, of course, is surprise, with in some cases, a flow of adrenaline for obvious reasons into the bloodstream, and all of the secondary effects of adrenaline. But after a certain amount of time, if there's enough time there exposed to the phenomenon, let's say for minutes or more than like a half hour, which sometimes happens, the mental process goes from surprise to perhaps excitement or more curiosity. They're trying to cope with perhaps an existential event, maybe a threatening event, until they learn that in fact they're not going to be hurt or killed by the phenomenon. And so they go into a processing mode where they try to understand, gee, what is this thing? And does it want to communicate? And if it does, how am I going to do that? Should I run away? They go through a series of kind of logical responses, if you will, which are very self-oriented. They have to do with self-protection, which makes very good sense. As far as I'm concerned, I do the same thing. After that phase, I think another phase would be much more intellectual or philosophical, and ask some really deep questions about, gee, is there life in the universe and that sort of thing. But that's gone beyond self-protection. That's now into a much more cranial end of things, academic end, let's call it. So I guess just in a quick summary, that would be the stages that I would see happening.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Also, back reflecting again on that Tehran case that I mentioned, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. He wrote a chapter in my 2010 book about that event, and his final comment to that chapter, after being so focused on trying to protect his airplane and everything, his final comment was that his biggest regret was that he did not try and communicate with whatever this was, that he didn't try and reach out. It was just such a a human response that you, in the moment, like you mentioned, there's after effects, and in the moment you're not necessarily thinking along those lines.
Yeah, well, that raises the CE5 question of human initiated contact. And I don't know if you want to get into that or not, but it's fundamental. There's a kind of a human need to close the loop, the uncertainty loop. And I think pilots experience the same thing. And some pilots will try to communicate in some way with the phenomenon. Not all of them, but some of them do. And some of them are surprised to get a response back. And that's a CE5 case.
Yeah, maybe. I know there were some questions from the Reddit viewers that we just haven't gotten to yet about the CE5. And I just want to mention to the viewers, the reason these questions came up is because Dick wrote this book. It's actually, it was a privately published book. So
No,
there
it
weren't
wasn't.
copies made, but this is the cover,
No.
in which he studied these CE5 events. And so, yeah, it would be wonderful if you could talk about this, Dick, because there were some questions about it.
Sure. Those who know me know that I'm a skeptic on much of this subject. And trained as a scientist, I'm looking for evidence to disprove it. I've never seen anything myself, but I leave that door open because I might, and that's fine. But in the process of meeting a lot of people over the years and doing some in-depth research on this, I set out as a skeptic to say that there's no case where humans have tried to communicate with the phenomenon. Now, fast forward to the SETI organization by Dr. Stephen Greer, and he put an organization together to do exactly that, to be proactive towards the phenomenon. And I must say that the UFO community in America particularly has been very passive. And what I mean by that, they have done interesting things, but they sit there and wait for the phenomenon to appear. Now, what Dr. Greer has attempted to do is to develop an approach which is proactive and organizes the participants, the humans, in a way that might somehow attract the attention and get a response back from the phenomenon. And that's what he claims to have done. Now, I set out to disprove that. I really did, because I didn't think it really would work. It wouldn't happen. And much to my surprise, after doing a lot of reading and searching, I came across over 200 cases worldwide, not just America, where people have done exactly that. They have signaled the object in the dark night sky with a flashlight, for instance, with a code of some kind, short, long, 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 short. And after a brief delay, they get a visual signal back, short, long, long, short, or others. It wasn't always exactly the same. Well, I was surprised, and so kind of got the hook in my mouth like I was a fish on a line, and I began to look further, and I came up with over 200 cases from many countries of the world, which tells me from a research point of view that it's not cultural, language, religion, belief systems, education. It's basically worldwide. And that when the curiosity of a human being in India, Russia, America, England, you name the country, when they make a conscious attempt to signal, oftentimes, not often, but sometimes they'll get a response back, and that's a CE5. And so just in conclusion, in writing this book, I have a number of chapters. And one of the first chapter is friendly human behavior. And this is when you wave at a thing in the sky, that's pretty friendly. Or you have a flashlight, and you flash this flashlight, that's not too dangerous. And I found, I don't know, if I forgot how many cases there are in that chapter. The second chapter, however, is aggressive human behavior. And that turned out to be the longest chapter in the book. That humans are more likely to shoot guns, arrows, rockets, throw rocks. They've done almost everything for whatever motive. And you might say it's fear, but it might be something else. That an aggressive human behavior is the dominant response to humans in trying to communicate with the phenomenon. And there are some very outstanding cases that I could share, I won't, which demonstrate that very thing. And so, bottom line, is there evidence in this book or in the larger world that came from of intelligence behind the phenomenon? That's what I was really looking for. And by closing this information loop between a human to the object back to the human, if there's some correspondence that is random, then it's probably pointing that the phenomenon itself is a natural phenomenon, like lightning, ball lightning, some atmospheric effect, weather. However, if in this back and forth communication, the human receives the same message that he sent, that suggests non-random. That suggests intelligence. And I have to go on record in saying publicly that that's what I found, evidence for intelligence. And I'll just leave it at that.
That's fascinating, because I do remember back in the early days, Dick, before people even accepted that UFOs were real, back, between 2000 and 2017, basically, one of the questions I always focused on was that question of intelligence, because there were so many examples of it. And how could someone deny, that there was something really mysterious going on when the object is responding and showing intelligence, as it does when it plays around with the aircraft? So it's just such an important component. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I forgot what it was. Oh yeah, there was just one. Yeah, just to mention too, the one event during the Belgian wave of 1989, where when so many people saw these triangular craft, and there was one event where there was a couple driving their car, and they actually saw the craft before trying to signal to it, and then they flashed their headlights towards the craft, and the craft flashed back. And then the craft followed their car for a while, but it was just spectacular, that it wasn't that they called it in, but they had already seen it, but then it responded to them. It's very, it's really, really compelling. Ryan, do you have, I'm sure most of the objects seem to demonstrate some kind of intelligence, but do you have any particular examples where they seem particularly intelligent in responding to humans? Or?
Well, I don't have too many to get into, but it's very clear that they're operating intelligently by the way they maneuver around an aircraft and avoid it, and seem to depart basically as it's approaching its final descent period. So yeah, there's just clues like that, but no direct communication that's within my holdings.
Yeah, do you find it, the fact that some of the objects that you've reported, Ryan, are so small, the chances are they're not inhabited by anything. Is it a great mystery to you that they could show intelligence even though they seem to be?
No,
something.
No, not. Gosh, certainly not in the past couple of years, right? We've seen how easy it can be to imbue intelligence with a few algorithms. So I would imagine, size is irrelevant, and whether there's a quote unquote being inside the craft. I'm sure the craft could likely exhibit intelligence beyond what we're capable of through an artificial means.
Right. Good point. It's I guess the question is when. Yeah, I guess they could have been doing that all along.
No.
If they're really.
Leslie, I jump back in on this. I think this is an important area to talk about. And let me pose the possibility of, if there is intelligence, that whoever's behind the phenomenon may be trying to communicate with us. Now, if that's the case, that's just a hypothesis. They're coming from somewhere else. They don't know really our language. How could they, perhaps? And so maybe they're trying to communicate. And these responses that we're describing in flight or from the ground or wherever is a form of finding out how we reply to them. And so how do they do that? They do something overt, like a flash of light, or they become brighter or dimmer, or they move around erratically or whatever. They may not know how to communicate with us. And so they might use EM, electromagnetic, at that domain. Or perhaps they would use physical presence if they have to. Perhaps they use paranormal, cognitive effects that John Mack was looking into quite extensively. What if they have just a psychic ability to talk directly into the consciousness of a person? And I think, to be honest and complete or direct, we have to keep that door open. We can't just close that door. Or that perhaps there's even a spiritual dimension here that scientists would overlook, perhaps. Many scientists would. But maybe there's another being or creator who's trying to communicate with us. That's, to me, I know that's getting us off track, but we've got to keep that door open. It's not just nuts and bolts.
I completely agree with you. Completely agree with you. And I'm really pleased that you said that. That's going to mean a lot to a lot of people. Well, okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, this is for Ryan from Beneficial Orange 738 from Experiencers. Ryan, you have spoken about the danger of UAP encounters to commercial airlines, fighter jets, and other planes. Do you know of any efforts to actively signal peaceful intent and willingness to cooperate with UAPs through technological or mechanical means if one should come in close contact, like signals, markings, attempts at telepathic messaging, and such? Can you explain the current protocols that are in use and how they should be adapted with regard to everything that's being revealed about the nature of UAPs now? What role could psionics play in this?
So, actually, if you could, can we go back to the question while I answer? Because there's a lot of different components, so I want to make sure I hit them all. Thank you. So, well, no, can you keep it there for me?
Can we leave the question on the screen?
Yeah, just thanks. So addressing the part about actively signaling intent, there's, a few ways you could do that potentially. And you address a couple of them here. You can go back to me now if you want. The first is technological means. We could literally cue a radio channel and, send out a radio frequency that's energetic towards them. Our systems know how to translate and turn to our voice, but there's no guarantee they have the proper receivers to receive anything like that, right? So, and that's kind of going to be the trend here, is that there's no guarantee that any of our tools that we utilize to communicate from a jet or even vocally, right, there's no guarantee that those would be effective. But communication happens nonetheless, right? Potentially. So we are sending energy out with our radios, especially with our radar, and that would be the primary one. And so if it does have the potential to detect some of those energies, then it could perhaps interpret what we're doing as communication, but not the type of communication we're intending to send, right? Because it can't interpret the voice signals. It doesn't know what those things would mean, even if it could, but it's receiving energy. So it thinks we're pinging it, perhaps interrogating it, and it would probably be correct with the radar in that case. So that's probably the level of communication that is occurring, that, they're receiving energy from us. They don't know what it means. and they really probably wouldn't know how to proceed, right? You know, I'm just kind of like, I'm making up a scenario here, right, with a hypothetical kind of, you know, first contact scenario here, right? Maybe that changes if they've been studying us for 100 years as we've been developing this technology. And then there's the other aspect of it, which would perhaps be, you know, non-technological communication. Can we, you know, wave a wing at it and call that, you know, an extension of the human at that point, kind of signaling communication? Is there something you can do, you know, mentally? You know, is there, you know, you mentioned psionics, or, you know, tie that in a remote viewing, or, you know, there's a number of different words that describe various, you know, parapsychological phenomenon. And, you know, would one of those perhaps be a mechanism for somehow communicating with it? I don't know the answer. And, you know, to address the last question, is that there are no protocols so far as I know, and I'm fairly confident that's the case, where they're just essentially told not to fly next to these things anymore. So there's no kind of approaching and circling and trying to communicate in some fashion, which again is not clear how that would be done effectively. That's kind of my interpretation of probably what the state of play is for that, unless there's like a specialized team that's like actively doing that within the government as their primary activity.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think, if either one of you think it's possible or even likely that some of these highly secret special access programs, I mean, it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't want to be working on possible communications. And I wonder if, maybe it's just speculation, or you may have heard from people off the record as to whether there are secret programs in which they have been working on trying to develop some kind of way of communicating that they're not telling us about. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
If you make the assumption that there's been a long-term program to investigate this, you would have to assume that that would be one of the core efforts.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know to what extent they've been successful or not.
Yeah. Hey, Leslie, let's take for just a moment to look back at the SETI program. This Arecibo disk trying to send signals out, or I'm sorry, to passively listen for signals coming in. Well, there's a big controversy back then, and perhaps it's still going on, where should we be doing this at all? Right. Are we disclosing our presence in the universe and so forth? And that's a valid question. It needs to be debated and considered very carefully. But it raises the same question for a pilot flying an airplane. We might say that the phenomenon being close to the airplane already knows the presence of the pilot and the airplane. So that's not the issue. It's what the pilot does in the presence, the proximity of the phenomenon. Is he acting aggressively? Well, there are many documented cases of pilots shooting, using their gun sights to shoot at the object. That's not a friendly thing to do to a visitor. It's different for an enemy, but they were interpreted as being enemy. I just wanted to throw that in because that's another dimension here. Do we want to disclose our presence or not?
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's a reasonable question, but most people probably would think we do just because we want to know, we want to connect, but it is a debate. I know I've been following that to some extent. There's arguments to be made on both sides, I think. All right. Let's see. This is a really long question here. It's from Experiencers Wooden Passenger 8683. Question for both of you. Concerning the nature of UAP, a significant sighting I had around 1975 showed a UAP morphing. When I remembered this sighting after many years, I looked more deeply into this UAP ability to shape change, an ability that to me appears to get less attention than it deserves. Some researchers, like Joseph Burke, MD, postulate that at least some UAP sightings are sophisticated projections of some kind rather than physical objects, which is the virtual experience hypothesis. I would be interested in some comments, opinions, speculations concerning Ryan Graves and Dr. Haines' take on UAPs. Let's call it composition.
Wow. Oh boy. Yeah, virtual changes. This is taking what the writer is really asking, how physical is physical? How firm are the molecules? Is there a dimension of mental coordination or cooperation or communication here that has only energy involved and nothing else? Nothing else. And that's a $64 question. We're still looking at that. And it's a very fruitful field for philosophizing, writing fictional books and so forth for fun. But it's a very serious question too, because it gets at the issue of the spirit of man. We can use the word spirit, but nobody really can define it very well. You can't measure it, but it's there. It can control behavior. So I think maybe we need to broaden our acceptance levels as scientists and technologists and so forth, to be a little more open-minded in this other dimension or domain that this gentleman is talking about, this virtual dimension. That's about all I could say at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that, being able to intercept our ability to observe the world and, influence that signal is, the way I interpret the way that what they were suggesting essentially. And for me, maybe I think like that because that's how a lot of electronic warfare systems work, either on our jets or elsewhere, right? We receive a signal of someone trying to learn about us. We interfere with the signal and then we send it back so it looks the way we want it to look. And it wouldn't be a far cry if someone had the ability to, implant a chip in your brain, if you will, to observe all your neural activity to perhaps make those changes. And there might be more sophisticated ways to do that other than implanting a chip. Possibly at range, right? So, I mean, that's the logical path I would take to how you would potentially manipulate someone's mind to influence what they're seeing or observing. But, I think there's probably simpler explanations for the amorphous shape. And, it's reports that we've received as well. And I think perhaps one of the simplest conclusions, conclusions, but, ways to interpret it is that, you could be looking at something theoretically that you have no contextual framework for whatsoever. So, when you look at something and it looks like a weird plane, it looks like a weird plane to you because it kind of looks like a plane. But if you show a plane to a caveman, he doesn't know why that rock looks like that, right? And he just has no framework for fitting it in. So if you're looking at something and it's moving in ways that, appear very strange to you, if you had the right context about how that system worked and what it was doing, then it might make perfect sense about how it was moving, even if it was moving with technology that might not exist here, right? More of a fluid metal reshaping than, a door opening. So I would guess that would probably be the most simplest explanation. Another potential explanation could be that the visual field is being changed due to a manipulation of space-time itself, that theory of how these are propulsed. If that is accurate, it would also affect what these things actually look like because the optics are bending around the object, and that would cause it to look like it's moving and changing, even though perhaps it might just be the propulsion system is changing, and therefore it's changing what it looks like. So, I think there's a lot of different ways that we could think about what that means. I think the conscious influence section or the, electronic warfare against the mind, I think is an interesting one, but I think there's more tangible things that we could work toward figuring out first.
Mhm.
Because I mean that goes right to the core of our understanding of reality, right? I mean that's directly moving us into an area that I think is even beyond consciousness, right? As far as our lack of understanding.
Fascinating.
Yes. Leslie, let me just share something briefly that
Please.
Dr. J. Allen Hynek shared with me a long time ago, and it's been quoted many places. He said that there's going to be a physics of the 22nd century, and he's right. And what he's really saying is that we don't know everything now, and that we have a long way to go, and the physics is going to change in the process, and that we need to be staying open to this change and willing to accept new approaches. And that's what we're both talking about right now. The introduction of whole new fields of science, for instance, which don't even appear on any graduate school curricula right now, brand new. And it may be much less physical than we like to think of now. I just leave that door open.
Yeah.
In my career, I've had people who want to force me into the end of a long continuum. And let's say it's this end here. And that end of the UFO continuum is the nuts and bolts end, where we have little gray men and metallic objects that fly around and do strange things. At the other end of that continuum is the complete spiritual end, where it's without mass. It may have energy, but it has no mass. We'll try to figure that out. And people try to force me into one complete end or one complete the other end. And I ask them, please give me the privilege of staying somewhere in the middle and let the data speak for itself. That's what science does. It doesn't force you into a position that the data is denied by the data. And so I think this is kind of related to what we're talking about here, that culture comes along and sees things in the night sky and wants to turn them into the nuts and bolts end of things over here, when in fact it could be something very different and doing camouflage, you might call it, to make you think you're over here when in fact you should be over here. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, it makes sense to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving more and more towards understanding the relationship of consciousness itself to the phenomenon, and the relationship of the phenomenon to all kinds of other elements of human consciousness, which is, it's just really very expansive. And eventually, I guess the scientific model is going to have to incorporate more and more of that over time. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I see us moving more in that direction. We have a few more questions, and then we're going to be kind of concluding this. But here's another one from UFOB. DreamArcadeStudio is the name of the person. You've likely seen near miss or close encounter data that's rarely public. Do you think these incidents pose a genuine collision safety concern, or do UAP often display a kind of avoidance intelligence? And how should aviation authorities adapt their protocols in response? And which phase of the flight or type of flight operation is most lacking in consistent high-quality data? If you could design an ideal data gathering program to fill those gaps, what would it look like? I think we've touched on a lot of this already, but if either of you want to add anything else based on this question.
If you, I wouldn't mind looking at the question again while I answer some. I'm sorry.
Sure. Let's put the question back up.
There's a lot of components there, but so in my experiences, the objects seem to be standoffish but nearby, and if you engage, they just continue to do what they were doing, and you're kind of assuming the risk for what happens at that point. That's kind of my general assessment of how these go. So they're not, you're not catching up by them. If you're like truly going to try to impact with this jet, I don't know what's going to happen, because I don't know of any cases of anyone that's tried to kamikaze one of these things to see if it would actually move, right? But I guess that would be the ultimate test. But I'm not aware of that. People have seen these on takeoff, they've seen them on landing, they've seen them, at altitude, they've seen them, across the spectrum of training operations for the military, day and night. Over land, I would say the data is perhaps surprisingly more inconsistent or more lacking over the land. Air traffic control radars they don't cover everywhere. They mostly use transponders nowadays. And at least on the coast, we have like air traffic identification zone radars for ensuring our national borders, essentially, right? So we do have those systems on the coast. We don't have those spread out in Nebraska and everywhere else. We don't have access to that data, so there's an assumption that there's interesting things there, but there is significantly more coverage on the coast for radars than over land. Yeah.
Okay, just add a simple point here that at least looking at older data, up to about 2000, let's say, or a little after, I think the majority, to answer the question raised, that the majority of pilot sightings we're familiar with occurred after dark, first of all, at altitude, and were generally lights in the night sky. Not always. Sometimes they were up close and quite a bit of detail on the phenomenon itself, which again raises the question of energy management and navigation, and in flying in formation, for instance, since we have quite a number of cases that we found that there are more than one object involved in a flight formation, and they're very dynamic. I wrote a book on this some years ago called Project Delta, where I took a look at the data from around the world only on cases where there were two or more objects seen at the same time in the same place. And what did they have in common? Were there any cultural differences? Did the Italians, there were quite a number of cases around Italy, by the way, but did the Italians see something different than the French, than the British, the Americans, the Canadians, and so forth? Trying to look at patterns, basically, from a research point of view. And so our discussion so far today has been pretty much single objects, single phenomena, but we shouldn't forget the possibility of multiple at the same time. That raises some very interesting questions. Flight navigation and maintaining distance, and flying formation, and then changing formations rather quickly in three-dimensional space. Ryan, I'd be interested if you have any cases like that with more than one phenomenon at the same time in place.
Yep. There's some instances where one of the, a group of objects was off the wingtip of an aircraft, and it was three individual spheres of light that were different colors each. And they were maneuvering independently within their kind of, some confined area, but operating off the wing, and then they, as a group, would reposition around the aircraft. Certainly others I've seen, multiple objects, multiple spheres. There are number of groups. Yeah, so it's I'd say probably like 30% or 20% of our cases involve more than one object.
I interviewed a B-52 captain. I won't go into a lot of details, except to say that he was delivering this airplane from Wichita, right off the line, the Boeing line, to a Air Force base in the southwestern corner of the country. It had no radar, no guns on board, only a flight crew, and they were just ferrying the airplane to the base. Clear sunny day, the sun was about overhead, and what he told me said, he said basically that an object appeared, a round sphere, he estimated about 3 or 4 or 5 feet diameter, polished aluminum or silvery color, appeared off the left wingtip, and very soon an identical object appeared off the right wingtip. An object appeared behind the tail of the aircraft, and the tail gunner, the observer back then, he had no guns, radioed on the intercom that, hey, we're being tailed by this object that looks like this, and an object above and an object below. So there's 5 spheres, identical spheres, tracking this B-52 at cruise altitude on autopilot. Well, I asked him, what did he do in this case? Well, how did you respond? He said, well, I didn't know what to do. I've never been trained for that. And he said, I took it off autopilot and put it into an evasive dive to try to get away from these objects, whatever they were. He said, whatever I did, they maintained a constant position relative to the airplane. And so he finally kind of gave up, and he added power and came back up to altitude and continued on autopilot, because he said there's nothing he could do about it. And then he said, after I think he said 15 minutes of continued flight, the objects departed from the airplane in the exact opposite order in which they'd arrived. That, to me, says intelligence, control of some kind. It raises some fundamental questions, fascinating questions about all kinds of things. Why? Why did they do it? What were they? Who were they? Where they're going? They're going with him for a while. And one might say that they were simply tracking all his EM radiation. I don't know. Looking at his turbulent pattern behind the airplane, or whatever, aerodynamics, trying to find out better about a B-52 for whatever reason. I took this gentleman's story. He was a NASA pilot. I'll tell you that much. He wasn't a commercial pilot. He was a NASA pilot. I took his story seriously. And I'm still puzzled by that. And I thank him very much for sharing it. Because it opens up some very important questions that I think that aerodynamicists should look at, engineers, scientists, physicists, a whole cadre of professionals should be looking at this kind of data set.
Yeah. That's fascinating. It was Sean Kirkpatrick from Arrow. I don't know if you remember, but remember that video that he showed at the NASA briefing? It was a sphere, a metallic sphere, and he made the statement that these are seen all over the world, and we don't know what they are. Mm-hmm. It seems like the metallic spheres are very widely observed, but I've never heard of a story like that. That's pretty remarkable.
Oh, and it was 1952. That's when it happened. 1952.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago.
I don't think we had technology to do that ourselves in those days.
No.
All right. Well, we're going to go to the next question now. We have just a few more. This is from Sun Lover of Westlands from UFOs. And this question is for Ryan. What happens in the missing 4 minutes of the gimbal video? I mean, anyway, I don't know if we have the answer to that, but does the object make other unusual moves? Does the pod lose target at the end? Does the pod ever look at the fleet described in the audio? Is there a missing part of the Go Fast video as well? If so, can you describe what happens in that missing part?
Yeah, there is, or at least there was more recording, but the recording wasn't on the backside. It was on the front of what was seen. So it took the aircrew several minutes to essentially fly over. On the way, they recorded the Go Fast video, and then they recorded the gimbal video as they were transiting over there. And so it's all that time beforehand, right, where you can see the objects all on the situational awareness page through the radar. It's not necessarily a bunch of more video of the object up close. What you saw is pretty much as close as they got before they turned away. So what you kind of see is all them maneuvering kind of in concert together as part of like this larger group of almost a dozen objects.
Have you actually been able to see, because as I understand it, the rest of the gimbal video is still classified. Have you been able to see any of that, Ryan?
I'm not 100% sure. I know there's a few more seconds where the object gets essentially more wobbly, but that's the last I saw of it either.
Yeah,
I mean, for us, we were kind of more focused on the radar data itself, but so I don't know how much more time there is after that.
But I was told by people from ATIP that there actually is a fleet of them that you can see in that video. They just didn't release it.
Got it.
I don't think anyone has seen that without having the clearances to do so. I think there was one more part of that question at the very end of that question that I didn't read. Have you ever specifically seen the engine of a fighter jet approximately 30 nautical miles away from its back?
Yeah.
Through IR mode of ATFLR.
Yeah. I mean, we join on jets all the time, and we'll have our sensors on them, and we'll just kind of be running them down from behind, from a long distance over time. It looks like, basically at 30 miles or so, you'll see like the wingtips sticking out. You'll see the tail, and you'll see a bloom from the exhaust itself, but it'd be pretty well contained and tight coming out of the back. So what you see in the gimbal is a much wider bloom. The IR energy is, not what you would expect from a jet engine or the skin of an aircraft. So yeah, that's some of the differences.
All right. We just have a few more here. Let's go to
Leslie.
Yes, go ahead.
Just before we go into this next question, just a comment about the Japan Airlines sighting some years ago now. And I interviewed Captain Kenju Teruchi, the captain on that 747 flight, cargo flight from Paris, France to Tokyo. Mm-hmm. And he was in Anchorage at the time. He landed for fuel. But here's my point, that his initial contact with the squadron of lights, the formation of lights, was pretty much over the Alaska-Canada border, right at that point. And he told me that he saw ahead of him, directly ahead of him now, what he thought was the afterburners of a formation of jet planes, probably American Air Force planes. And he kept thinking about that until the whole formation very quickly moved from straight ahead off to his left to about 30 degrees, 25 degrees, almost instantaneously. Well, jets can't do that, as we know. It took time, but they went very quickly and stopped over here on to his left. And then he realized that was not a formation of jets. That was something totally else, but he could discriminate the heat, if you will, the light from the afterburners, I should say the engines. But the object then circled him as he's going. He got permission from Fairbanks to do a 360 to try to make these whatever it was go away. He thought he could lose it, so to speak, because it was pacing him off his left wing now. Very large object. Well, it followed him around that circle, 360 degrees, and he finally continued on his flight south to Anchorage. Huge object. He described it as big as an aircraft carrier in length. That's huge. He said that on descending from altitude, coming down to land at Anchorage, another aircraft was seen. The headlight, the collision avoidance lights were seen coming up. It was nighttime and dark outside, and so he radioed that other aircraft. It was a 777 climbing to altitude to see if that pilot had seen anything from his perspective, because the object was just right at his wingtip. What Teruchi told me was that the instant the pilot of the 777 flashed his headlights, his landing lights, if you will, in the dark night sky, this object took off to the left, to the east, I believe, very fast, disappeared into the night sky. Well, I was able to track down that 777 captain and talk with him to get his perspective, and he verified everything that Terauchi told me, and he didn't see anything. To me, it's a classic case of not just misidentification of stimuli, that goes without saying, but how well this captain did. Terauchi did a wonderful job to keep the airplane in control at all times. When he landed, he was surrounded by FAA and Mr. Stuckey and so forth of the FAA there to fill out forms, which he did, make a big report when he landed in Tokyo with his cargo intact. He did everything by the book, and yet he was taken off flying status by his company and flying a desk for a while.
Right.
I won't go into the details there, but it was an unfortunate result for him being a good pilot. End of story.
Right. And a message to other pilots that they better watch it, or they might end up in the same situation.
Right.
Yeah, and as I recall, the FAA a couple of months later just told us that it was a split radar beacon or something like that. I mean, that's another ridiculous aspect of this case. But, I also want to just let people know, since you just mentioned about this conversation with Terauchi, that Dick Haynes's full archive now is with Rice University at the Archives of the Impossible. And that collection includes many cassette tapes of Dick having conversations with pilots over many years, including Terauchi, including some of the well-known cases. And you can go into the library there and listen to these tapes. And it's absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to just put that out there so people know that your collection is there. And next week, there is a conference at Rice University, and I think some of the listeners will be there. And so anybody who's interested can go in and listen to some of this amazing material, and all your files are there too. So I want to thank you for making them available to everybody. We have a few more questions to complete, as long as everyone's comfortable keeping on with this. This is from Experience Wooden Passenger B683. And he or she says, this is sort of a historical question for both gentlemen. When radar first began to be used more extensively, both ground radar and the first radar in airplanes, how did the radar operators become aware that there were on occasion extra images visible? How did UFO observations get connected to radar signals? I mean, if you have a clearly visible UFO hanging over an airfield and you observe radar signals from that direction, it seems clear. But this is so at the beginning, late 30s, World War II. I suspect this must have taken a while to connect the dots. Also, no idea if the official denying kicked in then already.
So I can start on this one. So, radar technology has come a pretty long ways. And, back in the 30s, World War II, it was different how radar sensor operators worked. They were receiving pretty raw data from the machine, right? And they had to interpret what they were seeing themselves. And that was kind of key, because they saw a lot of birds, they saw weather phenomenon, they saw things that didn't make sense, and they saw the aircraft that they were supposed to see. And over time, over the decades, the software has changed that it filters all that stuff out before it gets to the operator, so that the person that's they're no longer interpreting the raw radar data. It's happening computationally, and then they're just getting a graphic that they can basically interact with and receive information from. So, I think back in the day, oh no, by the way, there was no, hard drive to store this data to. Basically, they were receiving it, they were acting on it, and there was no real storage except on tapes in certain facilities. So you saw something interesting, but there wasn't a lot to act on specifically. Now, over time, you don't even have the ability to act on that information anymore, because a lot of times, those things are filtered out. And especially, you mentioned specifically an object, hanging out over a base. Well, especially older radars, they didn't work very good on slow moving objects, right? They're looking for a specific speed. And more so now as well, a lot of the missile defense systems and other things, you're looking for very specific flight characteristics of the objects. And if it doesn't match that, then, it doesn't trigger the alarm, if you will. And so it's about utilizing those systems, kind of going back and saying, hey, what can we attach to those systems to potentially intercept that raw data and look for what we want to now, because otherwise it's just getting filtered out completely. I'm not sure if I directly answered the question, but just some thoughts about how those systems work. And back in the day, how there might have been opportunity to see more things, but there really wasn't any mechanisms for really capturing it or doing with it, as far as I know. And maybe there was a secretive effort to do that, but I'm not aware. But nowadays, it's almost like a technological problem that the systems have to deal with so much data, and they're so precise that they have to filter everything else out. But yet, things still break through, right? In a very dynamic system like you have in a fighter jet that, is designed to be able to see a broader spectrum of things than, say, a missile defense radar, then, we start to see things.
Got it. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I think we have to acknowledge that there are a number of documented cases where we had initial radar contact with an object at a distance, and then suddenly it disappears. And so we have to face that reality and explain it. And we can blame the hardware, some intermittent fault in the hardware, but we also have to keep the possibility open that the phenomena is changing its wavelength or its reflectivity or whatever, its absorption. And that opens up the question of a new physics, a whole new physics, which we don't have yet. If we are being visited by highly intelligent species, they probably worked this through 12,000 years ago and have solutions for it in order to protect themselves, to turn their reflectivity off, or let's say change the direction of reflection would be enough if they could do that. Now, I don't know if that's really relevant to the issue, but I had to insert that is a reality to the phenomenon. It can not just avoid radar, but terminate the reflection at times.
Right. Wow. I think we have two more questions, and then we're going to call it a night. This has been absolutely fascinating. I could go on for hours, but I think we have to let you two go soon. This is for both of you from HighStrangeness, Ash A2. Does the stigma associated with this topic present as a significant barrier to your work? If so, how do you plan to address the stigma? What actions can the average investigator or experiencer take to dissipate stigma? Important question.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. I mean, certainly something I've had to deal with a lot as a pilot, personally, as well as dealing with other pilots who are uncomfortable, sharing their reports with people. So it's very much a huge hindrance. And I mean, that's really most of my work is to reduce the stigma. I don't, sadly, I'm not smart enough, I don't think, to figure this out myself, right? We need a lot of people interested and engaged on this topic. We need resources. We need, real research studies. And, that happens when more people get engaged. And so by removing the stigma, through the work that I've been doing in public media and behind the scenes, in Congress, to remove that stigma, it allows more people to feel comfortable talking about this, which ultimately I think is what's going to move the conversation forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll jump in here as well. I must say that after working with NASA and lying low, keeping a low profile on this personal hobby of mine, I've found that the great majority of my colleagues there were very open-minded and not threatened by it whatsoever. And I'm very glad to say that. It is encouraging to be able to say that. And before I retired, some years ago now, I held about a once a month open house during our lunch hour. It wasn't on office hours, in order to discuss this subject in some depth, to understand what was going on. We would take one case and evaluate it very thoroughly from different points of view. The guys and gals in the room represented a lot of different specialties, if you will, technology and engineering, and physics and human factors and so forth. And during that whole period where we were doing this, we were breaking down this fear factor that it would harm our careers, because we were approaching it seriously. We were approaching it from a scientific, technical, serious point of view, for no other motives than perhaps pure curiosity. So I just share that as a practical encouragement for those viewers who may have a similar situation and want to start up their own groups to begin to explore this phenomenon. You can make a contribution.
Right. And that's kind of what Reddit is doing, I think. It's a huge community of people that explore it, and they're all making contributions by participating and thinking about it and talking to other people. So as somebody who's been involved with this for 25 years, I can tell you this, we've come a long way with respect to diminishing the stigma from when I started out with this. And Ryan is a big part of why that's happened. But I think the greater involvement we have from government, which we didn't have before 2017, has made a huge difference. So I don't remember the question, but I think we're moving very, very well to address this. And I think it's happening. It just takes time.
Yeah.
So we just have to,
Yeah,
some people now that are working on it. Yeah.
Leslie, you need to realize that you have made a significant contribution. And I just want to be one of many to thank you for that, and to encourage you to not give up and to continue. And we're with you 100%.
Thank you. I'm not giving up.
You're here.
I'm not giving up. And I thank both of you as well, and everyone else out there, whether you're a public figure or not. Everybody's work on this is important. Everybody. So, and I thank Reddit for hosting us today. And I think we have one more question before we wrap up today. So let's see what that is. From HighStrangeness, from our friend 777 again. What do you see as the long-term implications for aviation safety if UAPs continue to be a neglected area in pilot training and advisories?
Oh boy. I hate to say this, but I think it's going to be an accident. For one reason or another. It won't be deliberate, I think, on the part of the phenomenon, but it's very likely because of something happening in the cockpit, whatever that might be. Maybe human factors, maybe equipment, failure of some equipment from an overload. I don't know, but I hate to say that, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, and I think the situation is going to continue to get more complicated. You know, I think people don't quite realize how significantly our airspace is going to change in this country with the advent of some of these smaller autonomous vehicles, not just little, quadcopters, but ones that carry humans between, a major city and an outcropping city. So there's going to be a lot more traffic. It's going to be a lot busier. The airspace is going to get a lot more complicated and confusing. And if we're allowing this uncertainty creep in there, then yes, I fear that, as Dick said, it's going to lead to an accident in some fashion.
Right. It seems like that's often what it takes to promote change, something catastrophic happening before people address it, not just with this, but with other things as well.
Right, right.
And with the stigma, which still does exist, we're going to have a harder time with this one. So that illustrates the importance of the work you're doing, both of you, and Ryan being out there to address this before something terrible happens.
Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah. So I don't know if I guess we're gonna kind of wrap up now. We've been on for over 2 hours, and it's been absolutely fascinating for me to listen to both of you. I just wonder, is there anything you would like to say, maybe Ryan, anything about what you're doing or that you want people to pay attention to, or how? The other big question is that people often ask is what they can do. What can our viewers do to participate in a way that's going to help move things forward?
Yeah, I would encourage people to continue to be, proactive on this conversation, both with their legislators as well as, their friends and family. Be a good ambassador for this conversation out there. Do so carefully and cautiously, and understand that not everyone has the same context and, understanding of this that you do. Of course, if you do see something, you should say something. And, there's a number of organizations that you can report to, including safeaerospace.org. And we don't only accept reports from pilots. So we'd be happy to, hear about other reports that, might have just happened to an average person. And, it's interesting what we can learn when we compare those and sometimes correlate them with reports that other people and sometimes pilots have as well. So, stay curious on the topic, and thanks for being interested.
And also, NARCAP is still in operation, I have to say, and Ted Rowe is the executive director, and he and his group are more than willing and looking forward to data coming in from pilots as well. But having said that, it seems to me I'm going to put in a plug that the two organizations collaborate, if in a sense, perhaps a little more, because there's safety in numbers, if you will. There's a growth here in understanding that there's an overlap between the two groups, that Ryan's organization has a lot of members, NARCAP has contacted a number, and by overlapping, we have, I would say, greater political emphasis, perhaps. But having said that, I just wanted to thank Ryan for his work so far, and if there's anything I can do to cooperate or support in any way, feel free to call on me. And it's been
appreciate that. Well, you paved the road, so I appreciate the work that you've done. You're providing this service before I was a pilot and before I was probably alive at certain points. So, it's folks like you that were doing this when it was, I would suggest, much harder to do so. So thank you for that. And I'd be happy to see how we can collaborate.
Great. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Well, thank you, Dick, and thank you, Ryan, for being on this conversation today. It was really a pleasure to be a host for this event, and we'll keep on going with this, with our work on this issue. And thank you both for everything you're doing. And thank you to the Reddit community and people behind the scenes who are making this possible. They're amazing people. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.